Kindly subscribe, like, and drop a review.
Most 67 years old in the Middle Ages were well dead. But Eleanor of Aquitaine, she was currently wearing armor, defending castles and outrunning assassins to save her favorite son. She didn't just survive the Crusades, she rode into them as a queen and ended up the most dangerous one in history. Here is how she hijacked the 12th century. In the year of our Lord 1122, while Europe was still shaking off the mud of the First Crusade, a child was born in the warm belly of Aquitaine, the most cultured, most prosperous, most delightfully ungovernable corner of France. Her name was Eleanor. And from the very first moment she drew her breath, history held its own. Her father was Duke William X of Aquitaine, a man of tremendous wealth, tremendous appetite, and only slightly less tremendous wisdom. He gave Eleanor something no other noble woman of her era received, an education. She studied Latin, literature, music, writing, and the arts of governance. By the time she was 12, she could argue philosophy and outride most of his knights. Then, in 1137, the world shifted under Eleanor's feet. Her father, riding to the shrine of Santiago de Compostela, collapsed and died. Just like that, at 15 years old, Eleanor became the Duchess of Aquitaine, ruler of a territory larger than France itself, wealthier than any kingdom north of the Alps, and the most coveted young woman in all of Christendom. Every crowned head in Europe suddenly remembered that they had an eligible son. The race was on. In a twist of geography and ambition, it was the King of France himself, Louis VI, known endearing as Louis the Fat, who moved fastest. He arranged the marriage of Eleanor to his own son and heir, Prince Louis. The ink was barely dry on the marriage contract when the old king died too. Eleanor was now Queen of France. In one summer, she had buried a father, gained a husband, and acquired a kingdom. Not bad for a 15-year-old. If Eleanor expected Paris to match the dazzling cultural life of Aquitaine, she was in for a rude awakening. The French court under young Louis VI was pious to the point of paralysis. Louis spent half his days in prayer and the other half worrying about whether he prayed enough. Eleanor, who had grown up in a court of troubadours, poetry, and debate, found herself living in what she reportedly described as a monastery. Louis, for his part, adored Eleanor. He was utterly besotted with her, which is perhaps the problem. He was devoted to her in the trembling, terrified way of a man who knows he's entirely out of his depth. Eleanor, meanwhile, was managing political disputes, hosting cultural salons, and trying to drag 12th century France into something resembling civilization. The court whispered. Eleanor did not care. She never particularly cared what people whispered. In 1147, all of Europe caught crusade fever. The great preacher Bernard of Clairvaux took to the roads and countryside, preaching the Second Crusade with such passionate urgency that men reportedly stripped off their cloaks to tear them into crosses on the spot. Louis VI, always looking for God's approval, announced that France would march. The only question was, would Eleanor? The answer, delivered with characteristics, Eleanor directness, was yes, absolutely yes. Eleanor not only agreed to join the crusade, she raised her own force of 100 vassals from Aquitaine. She would not be left behind at a great Paris court while the great adventure of the century marched past her window. And here is where history begins to genuinely extraordinary. Let us pause here, because this moment deserves to be savored. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Mother of a Nation, Patroness of Poets, brought out the Second Crusade in armor, not decorative armor, not ceremonial armor, actual, functional battle armor. She sat her horse the way Aquitanian knights sat theirs, straight, confident, and prepared. The army that set out was enormous, perhaps 100,000 souls, though medieval chroniclers were optimistic with their numbers. They crossed through Germany, Hungary, and Byzantine Empire. encountering increasingly hostile terrain and increasingly suspicious locals. The Byzantines were not entirely charmed to have a French crusading army eating its way across their territory. Relationships were strained, supplies ran short, men and horses died of heat. But Eleanor, who had grown up riding the hills of Aquitaine in summer heat, adapted faster than most. She organized supply lines, she managed the Aquitanian contingent with practical efficiency, and somewhere in Asia Minor, according to scandal-hungry chroniclers, she became very friendly with Uncle Raymond, Prince of Antioch. Antioch was by any account a revelation for Eleanor. Her uncle Raymond of Poitiers ruled it, a man cut from Aquitanian cloth, cultivated, directed, and practical. For the first time in years, Eleanor was among people who spoke a cultural language. She wanted to stay. She wanted the crusade to focus on recapturing Edessa, as strategy demanded. Louis wanted to go to Jerusalem immediately, for religious reasons that had very little to do with military logic. What happened next divided contemporaries and has fascinated historians ever since. Eleanor informed Louis that she wanted an annulment. The marriage was so close in blood, she argued, a legal objection and not an entirely unreasonable one. Louis, devastated, allegedly had to be physically separated from Eleanor when she refused to leave Antioch. He waited until the dead of night, had his men carry her from the city over her furious and vocal objections, and forced her to continue the crusade. The Second Crusade was by any military measure a disaster. The siege of Damascus failed humiliatingly. The army limped home and Eleanor and Louis sailed back to France on separate ships. A detail so loaded with symbolism that even medieval sailors probably noticed. In 1152, after 15 years of marriage, 2 daughters, and an enormous amount of mutual disappointment, their marriage was annulled. Eleanor walked out of France with her lands intact. And here, one might expect our heroine to take a quiet break. Perhaps retire to a comfortable chateau, do some embroidery. Instead, Eleanor of Aquitaine, divorced, 30 years old and in possession of half of southwestern France, married Henry Plantagenet 8 weeks after her annulment. Henry was 19 years old, heir to England and approximately as unstoppable as Eleanor herself. The match scandalized everyone and threatened the balance of Europe power, and produced eventually 8 children and one of the most explosive royal marriages in history. When Henry became King of England in 1152, Eleanor became Queen of England, her second queenship, which was apparently not enough. Together, they controlled an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, and Aquitaine. It was called the Angevin Empire, and it was the largest power in Western Europe. Eleanor was not merely its queen, she was, in many critical senses, its co-architect. Eleanor was not content to be a decorative queen. She governed. When Henry was occupied in France, which was often, because Henry was occupied everywhere all the time, constantly in motion, eating while walking and writing while riding. Eleanor administered England. She held courts. She dispensed justice. She sent letters to Rome and to Constantinople. To every corner of the empire, she was, by any modern definition, a head of state. Between matters of state, Eleanor created one of the most remarkable cultural spaces in medieval history, the Court of Love at Poitiers. Here, troubadours competed for patronage, poets read their latest works. The Countess Mary, Eleanor's own daughter, presided over mock courts that debated the philosophy of romantic love with the same seriousness that other courts applied to land disputes. It sounds whimsical. It was not. This was the intellectual and artistic finance that forged the Western Romantic tradition. This was also a deeply personal project for Eleanor. Her grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, had been one of the very first troubadours, the first whose works survive. She was not merely patronizing an art form, she was continuing a family tradition across generations. Culture was her inheritance as much as land. But the great Angevin Empire had cracks, and the loudest crack ran straight through Eleanor and Henry's marriage. Henry was brilliant, tireless, and spectacularly unfaithful. He had affairs of legendary indiscretion, including a long liaison with a woman known to history as Rosamond Clifford, Fair Rosamond, whom Henry did not particularly bother to conceal. Eleanor, who had dealt with whispers and scandal before, absorbed this with the cool composure of someone already planning their next move. The greater rupture came from elsewhere. Henry's catastrophic conflict with Thomas Becket, his Archbishop of Canterbury, consumed years of his reign, when 4 of Henry's knights murdered Becket in his own cathedral, apparently acting on a rash outburst from Henry that he would spend the rest of his life trying to live down. The scandal nearly brought down the monarchy. Henry walked barefoot through Canterbury in public penance, while monks flogged him. It was not a moment of kingly dignity.
In 1173, Eleanor did something that still astonishes historians. She helped lead a rebellion against her own husband. 3 of her sons, young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rose against their father, and Eleanor, who had watched Henry systematically undermine her authority for years, chose her sons over her husband. She raised troops from Aquitaine. She attempted to write to the French court to coordinate the uprising. She was caught. A group of Henry's soldiers found her on the road, disguised as a man, riding in a man's saddle. The game was up.
Henry, who loved Eleanor, hated Eleanor, feared Eleanor, and apparently could not decide what on earth to do with Eleanor, made one decision clearly. He would not let her go free. For 15 years, from 1173 to 1189, Eleanor of Aquitaine was a prisoner. Not a comfortable exile, not a house guest in a pleasant manor, but a political prisoner, moved between English castles at Henry's discretion. Her movements controlled, her correspondence monitored. She was in her early 50s when the imprisonment began. She would be in her late 60s when it ended. Any other woman of her era, any other woman of almost any era might have broken. Eleanor of Aquitaine wrote letters, managed what political relationships she could maintain through intermediaries, and waited. She was exceptionally good at waiting. Waiting was not surrender, waiting was strategy. Even in captivity, Eleanor was not spared the cruelest blow of fortune. In 1183, her son young Henry, the eldest, the golden hair, the boy who had led the revolt with her, died of dysentery while at war with his father. He was 28 years old. Henry, who had fought him, wept at the news. Eleanor, who had risked everything for him, received the news alone in a castle room from a warden who probably did not know how to say it gently. Her son Geoffrey would die in a tournament accident 3 years later. Eleanor was 52 when she was imprisoned. By the time her confinement softened in the 1180s, she had lost 2 sons while behind walls. She had been cut off from the world she had spent her life building, and still, she was not done.